right, so welcome everyone. It is really a privilege to be with you today. My name is Noor and I'm joining you from New York, where I am an associate instructor in the nonprofit management program at Columbia University. And I'm the founder of Disruptivist, where we are growing a network of artists and activists with the mission to amplify the power of the arts as a tool for social change and innovation. And before we begin, I would like to acknowledge and pay my deep respect to the Lenape people and elders and ancestors of the past, present, and future. I acknowledge and offer gratitude to this Lenape land. And as we are gathered right now here together virtually, I invite you to join me in that acknowledgement and respect, and I invite you to reflect on the land upon which you stand. And with this land acknowledgement and in our commitment as change makers to truth and to justice, we invite you to strengthen the relationships between your institutions and the Indigenous communities where you are, to ensure that there are more Indigenous voices that are heard at all organizational levels. And that process begins with institutions recognizing where they are on land that is taken from Indigenous people. And in our responsibility as individuals and as change makers, working towards reconciliation and to holding the power structures and systems in place accountable, our big idea talk session today is on exploring the power of the diverse leader. I am truly honored and privileged to have been in communication and conversation working with these phenomenal women and powerful leaders. Our session today is going to look at the power of diversity as it factors into our individual and institutional success. And our speakers are going to tackle diversity through their varying lenses, drawing out why we cannot think about our collective future without acknowledging the critical role of diversity. And it is with special excitement that I am pleased to welcome Angelou Azilu, the CEO of Greenie Youth Foundation. Recently, Angelou authored a book named Engage, Connect, Protect, Empowering Diverse Youth as Environmental Leaders. This book is a roadmap for understanding how America is creating environmental leaders in communities that sit far outside the stereotypical upper middle class white liberal enclaves and explores solutions that are working in communities of color. And with that, I hand it over to Angelou for her talk, Sustainable Diversity, the Way Forward.
Thank you so much, Noor. Good afternoon, everyone, and actually good evening, probably good morning for some. As Nora said, I'm Angelou. I am the founder and CEO of Greenie Youth Foundation. I'd like to start off by thanking my grandmother for giving me that initial connection to nature. And even though, we had a 4x6 garden in Jersey City, New Jersey, that's where my first introduction to nature and the outdoors was really fostered. I'd like to also thank my mother, who gave me a bird's eye view of what it means to be a kick-ass entrepreneur. She's always had her own business, and I've watched her from various points, just leading business and leading people. I'd also like to thank my college, my alma mater, Spelman College, for really teaching me the importance of sisterhood, of community, and also for being the change that you want to see. And I always love quotes starting off, and I think it's important. The quote that I love the most is very, I think, appropriate for this time, and it's Angela Davis's quote. And the quote is, I'm no longer accepting the things I cannot change, but I'm changing the things that I can no longer accept. I think that's really critically important for what we're all going to be saying as change makers. But just a little bit more about myself. I grew up in Jersey City, but in upstate New York is where my parents had a 54-acre farm. And that's really where, in addition to my grandmother's connection to nature for me, it was in these woods, these 54 acres in upstate New York, where I developed this love affair with the outdoors. But because of the color of my skin, and because of the fact that I was this little brown girl, and also growing up as a young woman, it was the becoming an environmentalist or any career in natural resource management wasn't necessarily something that I was encouraged to do. And later, as I asked my parents, my mom was like, well, I just didn't feel comfortable having you in that field because it doesn't feel welcoming. It wasn't welcoming for me. So I certainly didn't think it would be welcoming for our daughter. So what I'm trying to say to you all is that the environmental sector has an access equity issue. It's what Dr. Dorcetta Taylor calls an eternal stereotype. And the stereotype is that people of color are not interested in the environment, which is absolutely insane. You know, from research that I've done, and I'm sure a lot of you have done, you know that people of color, as Niara has opened up, have a very deep relationship with land, a very a strong symbiotic relationship and love with land. It's where you eat from, it's where you thrive from. So we know that that's insane. So the question becomes, where did that come about? And it's really because you often hear people say, well, people of color have to think about things like, you know, poverty and hunger and education and unemployment rates. Well, all of that is true. Those are things that we have to think about. But let's not forget the fact that there is so much history that makes those things on the forefront of our minds, and things that we, because of equity issues, those are things that we have to think about. But my point that I often make, and that we've been doing within our organization, is intersectionality. You know, we have to think about those things through the lens of historical institutional racism, basically. So, you know, we can't talk about unemployment without talking about jobs for young people or adults in the green industry. We can't talk about poor health without talking about urban farms and, you know, ways in which people can see the environment as a way for them to eat. So in other words, we, as our former president Barack Obama said, we can't talk about sustainability without talking about economics. And that's something that's really, you know, it's been an uphill battle. As I said, I'm the founder of Greenie Youth Foundation. It's an organization that's been working for almost 15 years on the mission of engaging underrepresented youth and young adults while connecting them to the outdoors and careers in conservation. Our vision is quite simple: to make the environmental sector representative of society. It is so far from that as we speak right now. It's so homogeneous. It's mainly, when I first started, it was mainly male and white. Now there's more women in the movement, but it's still very much white. And it certainly does not have an inclusive feel to it. I started off in, you know, doing land conservation for the Trust for Public Land. Then I did it for the Department of Agriculture, and there's still so much work to be done. At Greenie Youth Foundation, we probably engage close to 20,000 young people, whether it's in environmental education programs, youth conservation core programs, working with National Park Service, Forest Service, and other federal land management agencies, as well as our Urban Youth Corps program. And our whole focus is really showing, giving access and opportunity to those who have not been at the table. And that's also what my book, Engage, Connect, Protect, Empowering Diverse Youth as Young, Empowering Young Adults as Environmental Leaders. I was like, what's the name of my book again? But yes, that book, you know, the focus is really debunking a lot of the myths that exist within the environmental sector as it relates to people of color. It's sample curriculum, because a lot of people are like, well, how do you reach people of color around environmentalism? So it's sample curriculum of how to speak certain language, maybe holding up different celebrities and icons, making that material really pop and resonate for the audience you're trying to reach. And then it's also a collection of resources. So I no longer want to hear people saying, I would love to engage more people of color, I just don't know where to look. Are they out there? So that's another thing that this book is doing. It's providing all of the lists of Native Americans, Asian Americans, Latinos, African Americans, all these people that are successfully working in this place. So it's really a a resource guide for mainstream environmental organizations. So I obviously can go much longer, but I want us to all, focus on, and I'm sure you're seeing now with this COVID-19, as we talk about, sheltering in place and, getting outside and doing things while doing social distancing, we see that there's access equity there, issues there as well, because not everybody could go in their backyard and enjoy nature. So these are some of the things that we're working on. But what I see is that we have to focus on community. So I'd like to end with another one of my favorite quotes by Wade Davis, which is, "Other cultures are not failed attempts at being you. They are unique manifestations of the human spirit. Let's try to be more of a community." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. What a beautiful message to, yes, we can virtually clap. And with that, please, thank you all for being with us. Feel free to add your comments and your thoughts and your questions. We will be taking questions towards the end. Our next Big Idea Talk speaker is Niara Valerio. Niara is the co-founder of Learnaby, a personalized learning edtech startup that provides academic support to high-risk, chronically absent students. Niara utilizes her own personal academic experience to inform her work at Learnaby. She is originally from Maputo, Mozambique, and grew up in Queens, New York. Niara will talk about her own personal academic experience, as well as her work with Learnaby, where she works to help chronically absent students graduate from high school. Her talk is titled "Reframing Our Collective Narrative of Academic Success."
Hi, everyone. Nora, thank you so much. I am really, really excited to be here today to talk to you guys. As Nora mentioned, I am the co-founder of Learnaby, and we pretty much work with high-risk chronically absent students to help them graduate high school. And what I wanted to talk to you guys about today was really my own personal academic journey and how that narrative had really shifted, and what academic success meant for me shifted over time, and how ultimately that informs the work that I do at Learnaby. So I'll start off by just telling you guys a little bit about myself. As Nora mentioned, I am from Maputo, Mozambique. I was born there, and I moved to the US when I was about 13 years old. And I obviously had struggles, just as any student moving to a new country would. But one thing that I always really, really took comfort in and really enjoyed was school. It was a place where I felt comfortable, that I enjoyed reading and learning, and it was a space that I really felt was my own. So I was always in upper level, AP classes and honors classes, but the one space where I really, really struggled was with math. It was something that didn't really feel natural to me. I may have been in all AP and honors classes, but what ended up happening was that I was consistently in like the lowest level math classes of my school. And no matter how much I tried to advocate for myself to be in upper level math classes, it felt like a space that was really, really inaccessible for me. And I think it's important to note that at the time when I was in school, though I went to high school in Queens, New York, which is extremely diverse, as many of you know, the professors really did not reflect the majority of the student body. In addition to that, there was this huge difference in the way that the conversation would go in my AP classes versus the conversations that I'd have in the lower level math classes. In my AP classes, the message was always that we could succeed, we could do anything, apply to that top college, you'll get in, whatever it is that you need to do, push yourself, you're able to do it, right? There was a sense of encouragement and motivation. In my lower level math classes, it was consistently about doing the bare minimum that you needed to do just to pass. It was, just pass this exam, get to that next level. There was no sense of encouragement. There was nothing beyond just doing the absolute bare minimum. And I think it's important to note that a lot of the students in the lower level math classes, a lot of times were ESL students. They were students who'd recently moved to the US. I mean, there were students who really needed that additional math support, but we just were not getting it. So math became something that I really, really struggled with. And when I finally had the option of going to college, I made the decision to study the most difficult math that I could think of, because I wanted to prove to myself that I could do it and nobody was going to tell me no. So I basically picked engineering, which sounded really crazy at the time, but it was my way of finally having access to something that felt so inaccessible to me for so many years. So that came with its own set of challenges. I was one of a handful of women in the program, which is often the case with most engineering programs. On top of it, even less so that there were so few people of color in that space. And a lot of my own narrative of what academic success meant to me started breaking down because I was struggling with my classes. It was very difficult for me to, study and make connections with other students. I didn't come in with this heavy set of math courses like so many the other students did. So I really, really struggled there. And once again, it was a space where I felt I could not necessarily connect with the teachers because there were no teachers of color. There were even fewer women. It was an extremely difficult time for me personally. And what ended up happening was that I basically left. And I distinctly remember the day that I made the decision to leave. I was in my differential equations class, and the teacher told us to go and take a break for 10 minutes. Everyone else went to the restroom or went to go grab a snack. I went to my dorm, put a toothbrush and some clothes in a bag, got on a bus and went to New York City, and basically showed up at my mom's house. And she was like, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be in school. And I just didn't go back. School had become such a negative experience for me that I just really couldn't stomach the idea of being there. And so I took off a year and a half. I worked, I did a bunch of odd jobs. I tutored, I was a hostess. And eventually I had the courage to be able to go back and re-enroll. And the way that I did that was through a distance learning course. So I was able to work and attend classes online at the same time. And it was great because it finally allowed me to have a more positive relationship with academics, right? I finally felt that sense of comfort that I had for so many different years by taking these online classes. And even more later, I decided to go to grad school. And I was talking to who would then become my co-founder, Rahel, and we were just talking about our academic experience, and we found that we had so many similarities in that regard. Both of us were women of color who in some aspect had tried to advocate for ourselves within academics and were just unable to do it successfully, right? We wanted to challenge ourselves. We wanted to take upper level math courses or whatever the case might be. And there was constant barrier in terms of what they felt we were able to do that just wouldn't allow us to get to that next level. And I realized that this is an experience that so many other people have. And that honestly was a lot of the motivation for us to even start Learnabee. It started from that sense of not feeling advocated for and not having teachers or professors who look like you or who are able to advocate on your behalf. Because really, I think that's what ultimately makes us all successful students, right? It's that network and support that we have from our teachers and our parents and friends, etc. So what we do with Learnabee is we work with low-performing students who are considered chronically absent. Chronic absenteeism affects about 8 million students every year. To be considered chronically absent, you miss about 10% or more of school in any given year. And the reason we chose to focus on those students are because those are the students who do not present successful academically in the way that we would traditionally look for success. So they're really struggling, they're failing, and there aren't enough resources being placed on those students, but that is where we feel we can have the most impact. So, it's been a really interesting journey because we see so much of that struggle with students not having the ability to advocate for themselves, for them not having enough resources because they don't necessarily present as the students who are in the AP and honors classes, but who are just as deserving, if not more, of that academic attention. And that's ultimately what our mission is. And of course, I wouldn't, do this any justice if I didn't bring up the reality of what COVID has done for our students and for the population of students that we work with. The reality is that chronic absenteeism already affected so many students in the US, but now we are seeing an even larger population of students who are being considered chronically absent, because the reality is we're in the middle of a pandemic. Kids are being expected to log online. Some of them don't have access to, consistent internet, to the technology needed to do so. And it's become extremely challenging. So my question that I think we all need to sort of think about as individuals in the social impact space and as educators is, do we continue to evaluate academic success in the way that we traditionally do, right? Ultimately, what I think has made me successful wasn't necessarily, sure, my grades or et cetera, and the schools that I went to, but it's really the resilience to continue to push even when things have been very, very difficult. And we encounter that all the time, even as co-founders. Rahel and I always joke that everyone's favorite word is no, because we hear it so often. But that is really what we need to continue to push ourselves forward. And it's, I think, the sort of language and narrative that we have to have around academic success, not to have students define themselves by these grades, but their ability to make connections and to persevere and to move forward. And this is even so much more important for students of color, particularly in spaces where there aren't advocates who look like them to represent them. So yeah, you know, I'm very passionate about the work that I do. And I think that this is really a larger conversation, not only in the ecosystem of education overall, but like as how we as individuals view and determine academic success that I really think ultimately needs to change. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Lorena. Yes. Thank you for the really important work that you do. I want to remind everyone that we will be taking Q&A at the end. So thank you for those that have put in their questions. And last but not least, I am really thrilled to be introducing you to Lorena. Lorena, I don't see you for some reason. Are you here? Oh, there you are. Okay. Lorena Garcia Duran, sorry. Lorena is the Partnerships and Individual Giving Director for Ashoka in the US. She joined Ashoka in 2008 and has been leading partnerships between social and business entrepreneurs since then. She also sits on the board of directors for an Ashoka Fellows organization called Freedom for Immigrants. It is a national immigration visitation network which is working to end US immigration detention by monitoring human rights abuse issues, elevating stories, building community-based alternatives to detention, and advocating for systems change. Her talk is titled The Responsibility of Conscious Bias, where she will make a case for the opportunity we have to become a nation of awoken citizens and the opportunity to build a new reality, one that is equal and inclusive.
Thank you, Noor. And I'm honored to be with the rest of you. Almost 40% of the population in Mexico lives in poverty, making less than $6 a day. 10% of the nation's wealthiest have more than 40% of the nation's total income. The level of poverty and all its consequences are more acutely felt amongst the indigenous population, which makes up 20% of the 126 million people living in Mexico. I was raised in Mexico, and domestic workers played an instrumental role in my childhood. I grew up with conflicting and polarizing sentiments towards the people that worked in my home. On one side, these people were at times my closest friends and loving caregivers, while at the same time, the classist and racist society all around pushed me to detach myself physically and emotionally from them. As you can imagine, I grew up with an internal conflict that, looking back, I'm quite grateful for, since it helped me become more aware of my own biases. Growing up like this is quite normal for a good amount of Mexicans. If you have watched the movie Roma, you might have a better understanding of what I'm talking about. The movie invites the spectator to question human biases while aiming to deconstruct racist and classist stigmas. And it struck a deep personal chord within me, because it exposed how so many of my close friends and family were blinded by unconscious bias and were not able to see the unjust and cruel reality of the life of domestic workers that the movie so clearly exposed. As an interesting fact, the movie, in partnership with top organizations like those of Ashoka Fellows Aijen Po here in the United States and Marcelina Bautista in Mexico, has played an important role in pushing for new legislation. This legislation aims to protect and formalize the labor conditions for more than 2 million domestic workers, which are mostly indigenous women. And even though some legislation has passed, we are still far away from a society that doesn't discriminate and exploit its domestic workers. In 2012, I moved to the United States, and not until I arrived, I realized that much of the picture I had of this country was not only incomplete, but also in so many ways just not true. For example, I was completely unaware of the persistent income inequality and poverty. As of 2018, there were 38 million people living in poverty, according to the United States Census. I also became much more aware of the different versions of the history of this country. I remember learning in college the concept that history all around the world is usually told by the winners. Since then, I've always been interested in learning the many sides of the story. This is another big reason why I'm such a fan of the movie Roma, since the movie is told from the point of view of a domestic worker who's clearly not the winner of the story. So here I am, still in the United States, and beginning the process to become a naturalized citizen. This process has made me much more aware of my own privilege and of my position as a Mexican immigrant, and to recognize, more than ever before, the cruel reality of the majority of immigrants that come to this country in a very different situation than mine. Many of them have been here much longer, but most of them will never have the luxury to go through this process. Yes, this is the great country built by immigrants. It is also a country marked from the beginning by a history of white privilege and the inequity and structural racism that comes with it. In the journey to better understand this country's history, I bumped into a fascinating podcast named Seeing White. It opened up a universe of facts, authors, and resources that have helped me form a more complete story of where I am and where we might go from here. As I was learning all of these facts, I found myself bringing up these concepts with everyone I know. Seriously, everyone I know, including my work colleagues. And I noticed that the excitement about all these new things I was learning was not necessarily coming across the way I wanted. I realized I was being naive and ignorant about my approach. Most of the people I was sharing this information with were not necessarily that aware of the details of this part of the history of the country. I also noticed that even though many were positively engaging in these conversations, many others were feeling uncomfortable and threatened by it. This realization took my learning journey to a different level. It helped me understand that we all have a responsibility to dig deeper into our history, especially into those parts of history that have been kept more silent. Could I help bring these conversations around with being so threatening? Thankfully, I soon learned that people cannot know what they don't know. But once they do, there is a chance for change and correction. This is the moment when the door to become vulnerable and question our own biases opens up. As I learned more about the concept of whiteness and privilege, I began to connect the dots between my own life experience and that of those that surrounded me. Understanding that yes, we are all one, but accepting that color blindness is dangerous and that race is very real when you understand it as a social construct. Even though since the 90s, we have scientific proof that we are one species and share 99.9% of our DNA, you cannot deny the very real, structural, and persistent effects of white supremacy, power inequality, and colonialism. One just have to look at the devastated communities by mass incarceration, the increasingly dramatic wealth gap, or the persistent redlining practices, just to name a few. One of the most challenging moments during this journey has been a conversation with my partner, who happens to be a white man. Together, we better understood the perspective of the white man who agrees with every inch of my values and who's with me in the fight for justice and equity, but who also has had to confront himself by understanding the privileges and responsibilities that come with being a white man just by being born a white man. This added another layer to the journey, the realization that we are all victims and at times perpetrators of this system of inequity. Most of us had no saying in our own privilege. Most of us were born into it. What interests me is when we become aware of it, what will we do with it? I confess I still have racist thoughts, and I'm taking full responsibility of my unconscious biases. The courage that helps me say this out loud comes from my lifelong fight with the status quo. I grew up, at least like many of us on this side of the world, constantly bombarded by an ideal of race and skin color, an ideal of beauty, of intelligence, and of social class. This constant and many times subliminal bombarding of manufactured ideals makes it almost completely impossible for anyone to not be a racist or a victim and perpetrator of the colonialist and elitist system and culture we live in. We become perpetrators towards ourselves too. I think of all the microaggressions I've committed against myself to make myself more beautiful and become more accepted. To understand what I'm talking about, you just have to look at the successful industry of products to dye your hair, make your skin lighter, lose weight, look younger, become a Barbie. I recognize we are in a much better situation than we were some years ago, but still, these microaggressions persist in almost every corner of our society. And as you know, it not just affects us women or people of color. Think of the pervasive effects of toxic masculinity and the damage and suffering it has caused to boys and men all around the world. Becoming aware of these microaggressions towards myself has certainly not been easy, but this awareness keeps pushing me to honor my privilege and take responsibility. For example, when I'm in Mexico, I become white. I am treated as a white person with all its benefits. This comes with a set of responsibilities. How do I become an ally for those and to those with less privilege and less power? Remembering that a big part of our privilege was given to us just by where we were born, who are our parents, how healthy our bodies were when we were born, the color of our skin. We humans dislike the idea of not being fully responsible of our own success. It's threatening to know that much of what has made us successful was given to us, just, without us having anything to do with it. I think there has never been a better moment to take action, to turn our unconscious bias into proactive bias, challenge ourselves, question our beliefs, and honor our privilege by taking responsibility and becoming aware of our own biases and how they inform our thoughts, our feelings, actions, not only towards ourselves, but also towards others. I have to confess, I've become quite obsessed with this topic. Part because I belong to an organization that wants to build a world where everyone is a change maker. A world that works for everyone is a big aspiration. And now more than ever, after 11 years of being part of this organization, I couldn't be more proud and excited to be part of the Ashoka community. Today, we have the opportunity and the responsibility to become awakened, to mark this moment of history as the moment where we all stepped up to honor our privilege and change this system that does not work for the vast majority. Ibram X. Kendi invites us to become anti-racist. In his words, an anti-racist is one who is expressing the idea that racial groups are equals and none needs developing, and one who is supporting a policy that reduces racial inequity. I invite you all to become anti-racists. And even more importantly, I invite you to work on becoming fully conscious of all your biases. Dr. Tiffany Jana, a real expert on this topic and who I look up to for guidance in my learning journey, recently wrote an article about the importance of this historical moment to fight for justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. It spells Jedi. And I confess that as soon as I read the article, all I've been thinking of is this concept of Jedi champions. I dream with a generation of Jedi champions that decides to make this a truly just, equitable, diverse, and inclusive world. The global pandemic we're experiencing has made this effort far more urgent. And so I leave you with the words of James Baldwin. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I hope you're all as inspired as I am, and I commit to also being a Jedi from this moment on. We have a few questions that have come in from our audience. So I believe the first question is addressed to you, Angelou, and it is regarding your book. Have you ever had an experience working with groups from different countries trying to tackle global environmental concerns?
Oh yeah, so I did answer it online, but I will answer it here. I have had that opportunity. Our organization works with various countries. So we're international, and the countries that we've been working with are Liberia, Ghana, and in Nigeria, and dealing with reforestation and deforestation issues and creating youth corps that are around natural resource management. So it has, I mean, this pandemic has created an entirely new challenge that we're all facing, but before it was very nuanced according to different countries. Now this crisis is kind of, there's a lot of climate crisis issues that are affected, that are a side issue of COVID that we're dealing with. But yes, to answer the question.
Mm.
And just gonna hop in real quick. As we're going to Q&A, I invite all of our speakers to share their resources, and then as well as like information about their organization in the chat, drop it in. We'll also use that information to share out widely when the videos are the recordings are available in a couple of weeks as well.
Perfect. And the next question is for you, Niara. What aspects of your distance learning experience helped you feel comforted and supported?
I think I just had such a negative experience in my undergrad that I really, within that particular space, I didn't go to a school that I think was particularly diverse, especially coming from New York City. It was kind of a huge culture shock for me to be in that space. And I think once I re-engaged and signed up for the online classes, I was able to really focus on my work individually without having that ecosystem around me, which I really just never felt very comfortable in. I think particularly if you're studying something like mathematics heavy or engineering or economics, which is I ended up switching to later, it is very much very male dominated. And I don't think that my experience in undergrad had been a positive one. And so the best way for me to have re-engaged with the material was on my own, which really helped. I did eventually move to campus, and I ended up staying there and going to classes on time. But I think the most important thing for me was to re-engage with the content in a more positive way outside of that ecosystem, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you. And Lorena, I see that you are also adding some of the resources that were referenced in your talk, but a question from Jenna Crawford. Do you have a source or a tool that you would suggest to use with new founders and entrepreneurs as they begin to research the problem they want to solve about confronting their own identities and taking on an anti-oppression lens?
Yes, thank you, Jenna. I already put some in there, but I would certainly, especially for entrepreneurs and founders, I would recommend Dr. Tiffany Jana's latest book. I think it's something around fighting personal bias in an institutional level. That's some kind, I will get you the whole title of the book, but if you just Google Dr. Tiffany Jana, her 3 books will come up, and the latest one I think would be ideal for founders and entrepreneurs and all of us, but it's more on the institutional focus.
Excellent, thank you. And we still have some time for Q&A, and I'm gonna ask our panelists a question until we get some more questions in the chat. We are currently experiencing a global pandemic that for the first time communities around the world have a shared experience. Of course, it is exposing the faulty structures that are in place and the disparities that exist even more. What is something that you, in your change-making journey, has become apparent to you now that wasn't apparent to you in the last 3 months or before the pandemic? Who would like to start?
I'm happy to go. I think that a lot of the issues, so what we started originally doing at Learnaby is we started working as this one-to-one sort of mentorship / tutoring model to help students with the eventual goal of moving everything almost entirely online. We always had this goal in mind because we wanted to reach a larger population of students outside of New York City, and it's something that we've actively been working on. What's been really interesting is that we've been forced to do that so quickly and so suddenly without us having had any of the resources that we were planning to have in the future. And what's been interesting is that we were already aware a lot of the challenges that were there, but perhaps now they've just been so exacerbated and so much more in such a very short period of time that we're seeing a lot of students that were already chronically absent and were struggling fall off even the radar even more, and us having absolutely no way to contact them. It's been challenging because some students we were working with for the first time, so we didn't have relationship with them already, which would have made it easier to re-engage. And so we've had to sort of rethink our business model and think about the role that relationships and mentorships will continue to play, even if everything is moved online. And there's also been this huge disparity from the private school systems that I've seen versus the public schools and the ability to transition everything online seamlessly. The private schools already had tech infrastructure in place, and it's been a lot easier for them to make that transition. Whereas a lot of the public schools, the teachers have really struggled with the technology. The infrastructure hasn't been in place. It wasn't something that they were accustomed to. So my hope is that this really highlights the issues that we have in terms of the tech gap, technology access for a lot of these students, and to help propel this forward. And I think bringing this to light in such a stark way really highlights what those differences are. So I'm optimistic that the DOE and other stakeholders are going to do the right thing to make sure that these kids are included within the tech space in the future.
I'll go next. I think one of the things that we work on, as I said in my opening, is the access equity issue within the environmental sector. And I think it's even more glaring now that, like I said, with, this COVID, and we're now being told that we have to shelter in place and the social distancing and, just to enjoy the outdoors right at, where you are in your backyard or what have you. And that certainly isn't the case. I mean, we're seeing those inequities being played out right before us, that people are not within walking distance into a park, or they don't have this backyard that they could, access. They live in public housing and they're not able to be in the outdoors. And then the other issue is, so our focus has been connecting underrepresented young adults to jobs in the outdoors. So whether it's tree care management, landscape, all these different things in the outdoors. So when the order came in that we had to send everybody to a remote status, that was fine for our interns that are working with our federal land management partners, for those that are able to work remotely. But for a lot of our urban youth, through the Youth Corps, they were the ones that were out there, the ones that desperately need work, and they needed to be out going to a lot of these public places doing this work. And now they're not able to do that because of social distancing. So it's still a bit of a issue, and certainly a conundrum for us to keep them working. We have resources from the government and so forth to keep them working, but now, working where, and how is an issue. So that perhaps isn't something that we thought about, obviously, when we were first starting this foundation, that a lot of these young people that are part of our Youth Corps would not be able to go out and work on these projects in the outdoors. Because they can, but they have to be 6 feet away from each other, which is a challenge.
I think from my perspective, I think that because things get to a point that are so aggravated, I have hope. I have hope that because things, this whole pandemic has certainly accentuated the concept of inequality. I mean, you have, in the United States of America, you have more than 2 million people without access to running water. And this whole pandemic, the basic to keep yourself safe from it is to stay at home, shelter at home, and wash your hands. If you don't have running water and, you can't wash your hands, or you were used to having your kids go to the bathroom at school. I mean, we're talking about this pandemic has just really accentuated the level of differences between the reality of a lot, and honestly, if one could say, well, they're the smallest community, right? They're just a population, still big, but still, less than. The majority of the population in the world is not thriving. And so this global pandemic, I think there's a silver lining to it. It is helping us somehow the problem has become so much more devastating that my hope is this will become an opportunity for awakening.
Yes. Thank you for those answers. We have a question coming in as well from Christina about how do you get white male leadership to acknowledge and care about these realities without facing so much defensiveness? And for Lorena, white Hispanic males too.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not easy. It's not easy. I mean, again, I shared a little bit of my experience that my partner happens to be a white man. And even though him being, you know, a fighter for justice and equity, even he had to go through a very deep and painful, you know, analysis, deep internal analysis of how much privilege comes by just being a white man, and therefore how much responsibility comes with being a white man. I don't have the magic wand to get white men that are not awakened. I do believe, however, that at this moment, how society is working today, if you are a white man in power and hold, for example, have a team or manage an organization, and if you're not thinking about your own biases, if you're not working on it, I think you're going to be late. You're going to be behind, and you're going to miss. You know, you're going to miss not only opportunity in of course being a good person and learning from others. You're going to miss opportunity of market and business. The world is not white anymore. It has never been white, and so, you know, or just white. And so I do believe that it's a long journey. It's going to be difficult. I have hope that most of them are going to become awakened soon. Probably not because they want to, hopefully because they have to. There's no more option and there's no more time.
I want to add the second layer to the question that I forgot to mention. That is, how can we help, and what is the best way to help communities and students struggling right now? I think this was kind of a second layer, Christina, to that question, correct? Yeah.
It was two different questions, but
okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. And Angelou, I know you wanted to address that.
Yeah. No, I was just going to kind of piggyback on what Lorena said. I mean, this is certainly a marathon. It's not a sprint. You know, it's going to take time, but I do think that we have to shift our focus away from trying to convince, you know, to doing for and strengthening and holding up those that, you know, because I think we have to stop expecting victims or people who are not even in these positions of power to always jump on the other side and say and assuage those like feelings of how can we make you feel better? How can we get you to like us? How can you, you know, I'm really at a point now where there's just no time for that. And I as Lorena said, I would hope that those maybe white men who are in those power positions, they start doing the homework. They do the work, you know, so that they can be accountable and responsible for a lot of these dynamics that have come into play. No matter how they got there, it is what it is. They're there. So I think also to Lorena's point, if they want to remain relevant, you know, it's totally a business argument right now. You know, if you want more market share, if you want to still be relevant to your audience, you have to figure out how to work with diverse people so that you can engage diverse audiences, point blank. There's just nowhere around that, because your business will suffer if you don't do that. If you don't have people who are at the table with you that are in decision-making positions that represent different demographics from our society, then you're going to have blinders on, you know, and those people help you and inform all the different blind spots that you might have had. So, you know, the business case I often make to our partners, particularly in the environmental sector, outdoor retailers are the same, environmental NGOs, is if you want to be relevant, and I used to say 10 years, now it's like a year. You need to make those adjustments.
Mute, sorry. Niara, do you have anything to add?
Yes, I wholeheartedly agree with everything that has been said. I think the other thing that also needs to be done is I don't necessarily you know, I think that the best way to do it is for people of color to insert themselves in that space. And I really think that's ultimately what it comes down to. When you have leadership that lacks so much diversity at that level, I see it all the time in ed tech, which is extremely frustrating because you're designing educational technology for kids. And a lot of times that technology that you're designing, the people at the top don't look like the people who are going to be using those products, which to me is mind blowing. The only way that you can push and have those conversations is to make sure that there is sufficient leadership diversity at the top levels to push back, right? And so I'm very much about making sure you're taking up all that space, that you're inserting yourself into those spaces, that you're pushing those conversations. And I think that's very, very difficult, but I think that's when the biases start coming through, because you have to challenge and you have to push people to think in ways that they haven't before. I mean, that's, I think, what the reality is. You see it even in our space with a VC, right? If you have VCs who don't look like the founders, I mean, they're going to look for people that look like them, whose products make sense to them, and you're leaving out entire swaths of people whose products are just as worthy, but they don't see it from that perspective. So I think we need to occupy those spaces as much as we possibly can. We need to be in positions of leadership, and the more, the better. And that's the only way that we can really push and have these conversations.
And Nora, if I may add to that, and this is a little controversial, but I also think a lot about privilege. And I mentioned a little bit in my conversation, we all have privilege in so many ways. Just the fact that we have the capacity to join this conversation and ask speakers to even have a microphone to share our voices, that's privilege. And so even though, yes, the white man has the longer road to walk, I think we all have an opportunity and the responsibility to become aware of our own privilege and see how that privilege can help us find others that have less privilege and bring them with us. Because if we leave it just to them, I don't think it's ever going to happen. And on the other side, also to recognize that the system is the enemy, not necessarily one person or two people or a group of people. It's the system. And the system is, it's perverse. It makes you think that it's one guy or two guy or white man, and it's not. And in so many ways, we are all at the same time victims and perpetrators of that same system. Of course, I will not deny some have been far more perpetrators than others, but in so many ways, how today works, the majority of us, at least some of us that hold some privilege, we are at the same times victims and perpetrators. So the invitation is to do that, our own soul searching, to do our own bias searching, and figure out how can we, while we help others, become conscious and become responsible of what that means.
Can I add another quick thing to that, Nora?
Yes,
Lorena, my only thing is that power concedes nothing, so there's so much comfort in the power structure that is currently established that I don't understand, and maybe I'm just not there yet, but I don't understand how people who are in these comfortable positions of power are going to step to the side and allow others to share in that pie. That's the part that's really troubling for me, because we're now speaking from just wanting people to do it from the goodness of their hearts. And, the way these institutions have been so set up, there's so much benefit, there's so much privilege, there's so much that who in their right minds would say, enough of all that for me? I'm going to just share it with everyone. Like, I just don't want us to be naive in how we talk about this, because we know this country's history. Yeah. Like, we have to acknowledge the past in order for us to move forward. And given that, the past is very ugly. So I just don't want us to have, these blinders on about who we're expecting to do these different things.
Yeah, I'm with you on that.
Yes, Annette. There is a question from Donna, which it might have been addressed, but would you define a woken society as just aware of and being anti-racist, or including the more expansive issue of being more humane in the fullest sense of the word, as in the earlier keynote today?
Yeah, I think it's so much more than being anti-racist. I totally agree with, with the keynote. It's many levels. Like, just saying that you're not a racist person or you don't affiliate with anybody racist is just, that's one step. There's so much more, I think, to it.
Yes.
Yeah. And remembering that being a racist or an anti-racist, it's there's only a perspective around. I mean, it's almost impossible that we don't have biases. We as humans, we all have biases, and one can work on their race biases, but that's just a piece of the puzzle. The system, the system of inequity shows up in so many other ways. That is just one little piece of the puzzle that for sure is gigantic, especially as you were saying, Angelou, in the history of this country. But awaken means, not only seeing yourself as a whole, but seeing everybody as a whole. And also, I like to add what Angelou was saying, not being naive, and more importantly, taking a responsibility about learning history. I think that the fact that the vast majority of people are not that interested in learning how the hell did we get here? How did we, why is it that we live this way? Who decided that, that this was going to be the ideals? Who decided that that was going to be the power structure? Well, of course, the people that are in the power, right? And why isn't that probably one of the places where we are investing most of our energy? To me, is just mind-blowing. And I think that that's one of the best places to start.
Yeah. But I do think that people are uncomfortable with the history too, which is understandable.
Yes. Such important points. There are 2 points I just want to mention very quickly from the audience. One is that transparency is very often, from Donna, transparency is very often leads to accountability. So we need to make these unconscious issues more visible. That will begin to shift the power structure. And I feel like you just touched on that, and the importance as well of the historical narratives that have not been made relevant or amplified to be more amplified. And that's another strong theme that's been part of the big idea talk, I feel, sessions even yesterday. And then Clara shared a quote from her professor: "There is no woke, there's only waking." And with that, I would like to move to our next question that is in Spanish. I'm studying Spanish right now, but I'm not good enough to be able to translate this question. So if I believe, Lorena, the question was addressed to...
Where is it? Sorry?
Michelle?
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
What
okay.
what is it? Violeta Sandoval, the one about feminism?
Yeah.
Yes.
So she's asking, what do we think about the feminist movement and the impact that is having around the world, searching for structural change? Oof.
We have another hour.
Let's add a couple of drinks. I'll make just one comment about that, and I'll leave it to the others. I have seen it from afar. I haven't participated directly in the whole movement, feminist movement right now in Latin America. That movement has started in Chile, and those women doing that phenomenal protest dance. But I do belong to Mexican culture, and I think, to me, the biggest realization as a Mexican woman has been how much us as women have hurt ourselves. I was talking about all those microaggressions that are self-inflicted, and of course the system participates a lot, but the older women play a very big role in at least in Mexican culture. And so I'm very happy, I'm very, very proud to see a generation that is trying to dismantle that, and that is trying to say no more. That even the way that they dress is kind of a protest, and I'm very happy to see that. I think it's going to take, knowing the culture in Mexico, I think it's going to take, I hope not that much because we don't have time, but it's going to take a while, Violeta, and I'm happy to have, you know, a couple of tequilas for that conversation, because yeah, even sexuality and the concept of pleasure is such a big thing in women's empowerment in Latin America or in Catholic communities. So, but yeah, that's all I have to say about that because we don't have more time.
So we have gone over time, and there've been requests for happy hour.
That's a good sign. Yay!
I'm a phenomenal job. I know there's one more question I can see right now. So I'll ask this question, and then I want to give permission for people to leave and go on to other things. And I don't know where the co-presenters will be in the next hour, but feel free to extend yourself. This last question, I would like to hear from you how powerful diversity is, and it might be just a short opinion.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, since it's our last question, maybe we can add another layer to it, because there was the question that came earlier about kind of like your final call to action of what we can do as individuals.
Mm-hmm.
So if you could kind of elaborate on that answer.
All right.
Perfect.
Diversity is very important. I think it's like an invitation, you know, but inclusion is really more like acceptance. I think that diversity is just that first foray, and you know, obviously we need representation, and so diversity is important, but I do think that we're at a point now where we need to go so far behind it, above that and beyond that, so that, you know, we're getting, you know, like, to me, you can always tell when there are diverse perspectives that have been taken into consideration at the top, like at leadership levels, like whether it's in just something written, so for television, movies, companies, strategies. So to me, yes, diversity is important, but inclusiveness and equity are so critical, because I think that that shapes more comprehensively how we're going to be able to successfully move forward.
I would echo that, Angelou, and again, my invitation was clear from the beginning. I invite us all to become Jedi champions. I just love the concept. So let's be all Jedi champions, which of course includes diversity. But I agree with you. There's other pieces of it that, in a way, are at moments more important than just diversity for itself.
Right.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think, especially coming from an education background, that is so crucial, because you're working with such young people and individuals, and that sort of that starts at such an early age, right? In the sense that students don't see themselves represented in the structures, the systems, the leaders. Like, that is why we need to do it, because I think just going forward, it communicates implicitly or explicitly messages to our students that they do not belong in these spaces in some way or other. And so it's absolutely so crucial for us to do that. And it's not diversity, it's inclusion. It's also about being able to voice your opinions, having them heard, having them expressed, having them, you know, move forward, and to have a valuable seat at the table. I think that's, you know, it's important for us as people of color, but I think it starts with us being there at the table, and that's how we can really change these sorts of structures at the same time. Both of them have to happen in conjunction with each other, and for us to have equal voices to make a difference. You know, because diversity quotas are great and wonderful, but, you know, that's not what we want, right? We actually want to have seat power and leadership and be able to have a say.
Yes, wow, powerful statements by all three. I thank you all so much for your leadership, for holding the systems that are in place accountable, and for honestly advancing and lifting not just people of color, but all of our communities up with you. It has been a complete privilege and honor to be with you all tonight. Thank you, Michelle, and to the Shoka U Exchange for holding space for such an important conversation. And for all of you that joined us, thank you so much. There is a request that the speakers share their information as well. I just want to make sure that that message was received with our speakers. And yeah.
Can I just say, Noir, that if we were in Minnesota together, I'd want to have a glass of wine with each of you.
Yes.
So I hate that we do that, because that's the beauty of having these Ashoka U conferences in person. But I hold up a glass, and just know that after this, I'm going to go get a glass of red wine, and I'll be drinking with all of you.
I will go. Cheers, mate.
Oh my gosh. Hi, everyone. So, speakers, can you stay behind with me for just a second?
Sure.
And participants, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much, I think, as we all did.